Today is the 28th of June, 2022. It's the new moon lunar observance day, so we listened to the Patimokkha recitation today. The bhikkhus listen to the Patimokkha as we do every fortnight. And something that's been coming up for me is the letter and the spirit. The Buddha spoke of the letter of the rules and the spirit of the rules, and this can be applied to many things. So we can try to get things perfect externally, but we may not be following the spirit of the training. So in the Majjhima Nikaya, a lot of times in the suttas, the Buddha is giving Dhamma teachings, but sometimes there are a few suttas where the Buddha is giving Vinaya teachings as well. So there's a sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya where the Buddha talks about this. I believe it's Majjhima 104. And he talks about the letter of the rule and the spirit of the rule. And then he says, monks, in the future, if there is a disagreement as to the letter of the rule, that is a mere trifle, but if there is a disagreement as to the spirit of the rules, that's a serious matter. It needs to be cleared up. So we practice the letter of the rules in order to gain or understand the spirit of the training, the reason behind all of these rules and all of these training guidelines and what we're actually doing. And that goes for anything. The reason for doing the chanting, the reason for bowing. So understanding the spirit of the training is really important. Because if we just cling to the letter or cling to the external form, then that's the Silabbata Paramasa, thinking that that's going to purify us in and of itself. But only the spirit will purify us if we understand suffering, the cause of suffering, cessation of suffering, the path. One way to understand this is like chanting. So for those of us who get really enthusiastic about wanting to do things properly and perfectly, we might get into proper chanting pronunciation and try to get the chanting pronunciation perfect. But there's actually no such thing as perfect chanting pronunciation. It actually doesn't exist. There's no perfect pronunciation to the chanting. If you're Burmese, if you're part of the Burmese tradition, then you'll think the perfect chanting pronunciation is this: Namo Dada Bhagavato Arahado Dhamma Dhambuddhada. And that's perfect. That's the perfect pronunciation. Or thinking there's such a thing as perfect Pali pronunciation is like thinking that there's such a thing as perfect American English pronunciation. You could say that anyone who speaks California surfer slang is speaking perfect English, and that's the perfect and the right and the one true proper way to speak English. It's actually ridiculous. But that's what we're thinking when we think we're pronouncing Pali perfectly. So there is no perfect Pali pronunciation. And that's Dhamma. So it's understanding the spirit and seeing what is behind the chanting is a development of faith, recollecting the teachings. That's all that matters. So whether you do Sri Lankan or Burmese or Thai or the new American version of doing the chanting, then it doesn't really matter what the pronunciation is, as long as we get the meaning behind it. That's why the Buddha recommended learning the Dhamma in your own language. The Buddha didn't even speak Pali anyway. Pali is just a close approximation of what the Buddha spoke. He spoke an unwritten language called Magadhi, or a sort of like a dialect of that region. Pali is a close approximation of that. So looking to the spirit of the teachings, the spirit of what we're doing. It's for peace and disenchantment, liberation. That's what it's for. Another way of looking at this is samsara, just the nature of samsara as always being unsatisfactory. Or when we have mindfulness, mindfulness is for seeing that what are we doing that's causing us a sense of dissatisfaction and suffering in our lives. That's what mindfulness is for. So what are we doing? What are we craving? What are we hoping for? What happens with craving? What is this craving that the Buddha talks about as the cause of suffering? We don't want suffering, so we don't want suffering. Nobody wants suffering. But how are we going about trying to not suffer? Usually we end up exacerbating the problem, creating more suffering. So for most of us ordinary people, we'll think that getting what we want will cause us to not suffer. And that's the problem. The Buddha talked about wanting, or tanha, unskillful wanting, tanha, kama tanha, bhava tanha, vibhava tanha, the craving for sensuality or the obsession with sensuality, the craving or the obsession with becoming, being, the craving, the obsession with not being or blotting out, annihilation. These are three ways in which we try to solve the problem of suffering by fulfilling those obsessions or those cravings. But that's the cause of the problem. The Buddha saw with his wisdom and ultra-mindfulness that that's what's causing the problem, is the existence of those three types of craving or obsession. And that the relinquishment of those is the cessation of suffering. And the path to being able to relinquish those three is the Noble Eightfold Path. So there we have it. There's just no way around it. And the Noble Eightfold Path is what we need to practice. And that's how we form our lives. That's the Sila Samadhi Panya. That's the precepts, the right speech, right action, right livelihood, and so on, right effort, right mindfulness. Getting everything in balance, all these spiritual qualities. That's to ripen the mind or prepare the mind. That's all for preparing the ground, preparing the mind for being able to let go of those three types of unskillful obsession or craving. So wherever the mind is going, it's generally going to be cycling around one of those three: kama tanha, bhava tanha, vibhava tanha. So we might think it's very common for when we're younger. And I know when I was 19, I was having these thoughts, if I could end my own life, that would make it better. So that's vibhava tanha. That's the mind going to vibhava tanha. I could end it all, and then it would be better. But according to the teachings, committing suicide doesn't solve the problem, it just compounds the confusion. The mind continuum has to keep going, and it's not going to stop it. It's not going to liberate us. So, okay. So what do we do? Or we might think, if I could just have a break, I know the Buddha talked about all these types of craving and suffering and everything, but if I could just get a bit of a rest or a break, just go to heavenly realm for a little while and just have a little bit of a break, a little bit of a rest. But then that doesn't solve the problem. We got to look after ourselves. We have to get the next meal. We have to figure out what we're going to do next. We have to work. We have to look after things. We have duties and obligations. There's no break. There's no rest. If people could just leave me alone just for a little bit. But there's, even if we get to be by ourselves, then we still don't get left alone. Our mind doesn't leave us alone. All these things that are unsatisfactory. Oh, things aren't quite right. I gotta fix this, or I gotta do this, do that, clean this, clean that. There's no end to it. If only the world could be shifted around just this way or that way, or if only this or that thing didn't happen or did happen, then it would be okay. So watching the mind doing that. So this is like the Longpo Sumedho teaching, and coming back to just refuge in awareness, refuge in the real Buddho, which is awareness. Just knowing what the mind is doing. Where is it going? How is it? What kind of assumptions is it making about what I need to be happy and to stop suffering? So this is also a function of ignorance and delusion. Ignorance is avijja, so that's literally, you could say it's lack of knowledge, lack of true knowledge. I like to think of these two things, mindfulness and ignorance, in that the Kruba Ajahns talk about mindfulness all around, that the brightness of the mind, or the mindfulness and the clear knowing, clear awareness, is looking into where is their dukkha, where is their suffering, and how is that being caused in that place. And going to wherever there's darkness and a lack of brightness in the mind, and going there and seeing what's going on here. And so when we want to see avijja, we want to see ignorance, but then that's the nature of ignorance, is that when there is seeing, there's an absence of ignorance. Ignorance itself it's not seeing clearly. So when there's a full mindfulness and wisdom, what we call satipanya, that's when the ignorance is becoming less. And when there's clarity and brightness all around, then the ignorance is made less, or ultimately made to disappear. Because the ignorance is, that darkness is, it can't be there when there's brightness present. And then there's delusion, what we call moha. And somebody asked Longpo Cha, what is delusion? Where is delusion? And he said, you're riding a horse and asking, where's the horse? So this is why practice is difficult, because the decisions we're making, they're, until we really get a grasp, get a hold of the Dhamma, the delusion is informing our decisions as to how we practice. Our delusion is informing our decisions as to how we practice, how we choose to practice. And the delusion goes part and parcel with those different types of craving, the kama tanha, bhava tanha, vibhava tanha. It's informing those three. So what do we do? What do we do with that if delusion is informing our decisions? So we have to be careful. This is where we give rise to a quality known as saddha, or faith, confidence, where we just take the teachings and just apply them, put them into practice. Faith could also be thought of as courage, even. It takes courage to practice. It takes courage to question our own assumptions about things. Sometimes we can be really sure about something, and then, oh, that was just delusion. That was just a misunderstanding. So being very open, being very flexible, malleable. In the suttas it says that we get the mind to a point of being malleable, fit for work. So that takes a sense of openness. Another thing delusion gives rise to is a sense of what we call agati, or bias. There's different biases that appear in the mind and the heart. So that's, the suttas talk about biased by fear, biased by anger, biased by greed, biased by delusion. There's these different biases that occur, and that's also a function of just ignorance. So it's coming back to mindfulness, just to be able to see these things clearly. So seeing clearly is the spirit. That's what the letter is for, or what all these external trainings are for, is for seeing clearly. So that's what we call the spirit of the training. So that's about all that's coming up for me this evening. I'll leave it there.